What does it cost to paralyze one of Russia's largest oil refineries less than you may have paid for your car? On the 25th of May, multiple independent sources reported that Syzran had come to a complete standstill after a Ukrainian drone strike. Verified footage shows a column of black smoke visible for kilometers. But the real story only begins when you ask why this plant in particular and why now, because this was no accident. It was not the first hit of the month, and it will not be the last. It was the 11th, and 11 hits in 31 days are not bad luck. That is a plan. For centuries, cutting off an empire's oil meant only one thing: a fleet. Battleships off foreign ports, steel on the water, throttling the supply until an entire economy gasped for air. That was how sea power worked from Trafalgar to the Persian Gulf. Whoever controlled the fuel controlled in the end the war itself. It was a game for great powers, for nations with shipyards and admirals, and half a century of shipbuilding behind them. History is full of this lesson. In the First World War, German U-boats tried to bring Britain to its knees by severing its supply lines. In the Second World War, the Battle of the Atlantic helped decide the entire Western Front because it decided who got fuel and steel. And in 1941, when the United States turned off Japan's oil tap, it was no mere diplomatic gesture. It was the trigger that drove an entire nation into the attack on Pearl Harbor. Oil has always decided who can fight and who can only watch. Take the fuel from a war machine and you don't need to defeat it on the field. It stops on its own. But all of those stories had one thing in common. They were written by great powers, with fleets, bomber wings, and industrial dominance. Ukraine has none of that. No aircraft carriers, no destroyers to blockade Russian ports, no blue water navy to dominate the Caspian or the Black Sea. On paper, this country does not come close to having the means to clamp the lifelines of a nuclear power. And yet that is exactly what is happening. Slowly, methodically, plant by plant. Look at the map, and you'll see how absurd this really is. Syzran is not on the front. It sits deep inside the Russian heartland on the Volga, roughly 800 kilometers from the nearest battle line. That is a distance that was supposed to be protection, a buffer made of pure geography, a plant so far behind one's own lines that no planner in Moscow seriously expected an attack. The Volga was for centuries the artery of Russia, the river on which the country built its industry, its cities, its sense of itself. That is exactly where the war is now landing. That is the point. Russia oriented its defenses to the west, toward the front, toward the direction a war is supposed to come from. But the threat came from behind. It crept across 800 kilometers of airspace and struck where no one was looking, in the lungs of the war machine, not its fists. And while the world kept staring at the trenches, at the captured villages, and the lost meters, the real battlefield shifted in a direction almost no one had on their radar, upward and inward. You have to grasp this inversion to understand how radical it is. For 2 years, the unspoken rule was simple: the war happens at the border. The Russian heartland was effectively off-limits, protected by distance and by the assumption that no one could reach that far. That rule has fallen. Not through a grand offensive, not through a foreign air force, but through machines that a single truck can carry. That is the stage. A smaller country that cannot defeat a larger one on the field decides instead to take away its fuel, not with fleets, with machines cheaper than a used car. And Syzran on the 25th of May was the moment this plan stopped being a theory. Let's look at what actually happened. According to reports by Reuters, the Kyiv Independent and Ukrainska Pravda, the Syzran refinery operated by the Russian company Rosneft was struck during the night by Ukrainian drones. By the 25th of May, multiple independent sources, including the Moscow Times and Kyiv Post, confirmed that the plant had ceased operations entirely. Not damaged, not partly throttled, stopped. That is an important distinction. Over the past 2 years, there have been many headlines about burning refineries. A fire, a few hours of smoke, then the usual statement from Moscow that everything was under control, the damage limited. Syzran is different. Here the sources do not speak of a fire that was put out, but of a standstill. And a standstill at a plant this size is not an incident repaired overnight. How big Syzran processes by open figures around 8.9 million tons of crude oil per year. This is no provincial plant. Yeah, this is a hub. And what matters is what it produces: fuel that flows, among other things, into military aviation, plus products exported via the Volga and the Caspian Sea. In other words, this refinery doesn't just fill cars in the Samara region. It fuels parts of the war itself, and it earns the hard currency that finances that war. And it was not alone. Here lies the real heart of the story. According to the Ukrainian drone commander Robert Bravdy, Syzran was the 11th strike on a Russian refinery in this single month. 11 plants in 31 days. Let that number sink in. That is on average one hit every 3 days deep in the Russian rear against a target that cannot dodge, cannot hide, and cannot shoot back. The data points to something far bigger than a single spectacular attack. It is a campaign, a systematic patient campaign against exactly one sector Russian refining capacity. No indiscriminate bombing, no symbolic pinpricks. Rather the method of a siege, except the siege engines do not stand before the walls. They come from the air, and it marks an evolution. 2 years ago, Ukrainian deep strikes were rare, isolated, and often dependent on foreign permission. Today they are a doctrine carried by domestically produced drones fired on Ukraine's own calendar against a growing list of targets across multiple Russian regions. And why drones, not missiles? That too is part of the logic. Ukraine never had enough long-range missiles to sustain a campaign of this duration, and the use of Western systems was long restricted by political conditions. A domestically built long-range drone clears both hurdles at once. It costs little, it can be produced in numbers, and no one in a foreign capital has to authorize its launch. Ukraine has built itself a weapon that it alone controls. That is almost as strategically significant as the damage itself, and the scale can be roughly grasped. Russia's refining capacity is concentrated in a manageable number of large plants. When 11 of them are hit in a single month and several fall offline for weeks, we are not talking about a rounding error in the statistics. We are talking about a tangible bite out of national processing output month after month for as long as the tempo holds. And the images confirm it. The verified footage from Syzran shows a column of black smoke visible for kilometers cross-checked across several independent sources. That matters, because in this war, propaganda is cheap and truth is expensive. But when Reuters, the Kiev Independent, Ukrainska Pravda, the Moscow Times, and Kyiv Post independently arrive at the same finding plant standing still, that is not a rumor from a Telegram channel. That is a documented fact. The Russian side, it must be said, honestly stays largely silent about the actual consequences. Official statements remain vague, speaking of repelled drones and limited damage. That very silence about the scale is itself a signal, because if the damage were truly limited, there would be no reason to conceal it. Now we come to the part the other channels skip. They will tell you Ukraine set a Russian oil refinery on fire. That's true, and it's also completely beside the point. The real question isn't that something burned. The question is why this one sector and why this method changes everything. Now, let's take it apart. Let's begin with the economics of destruction. A refinery is the exact opposite of a moving target. It is enormous, it is fixed, it has stood in the same spot for decades, and its coordinates are no secret. You can hide a tank, you can move a brigade, you cannot relocate a refinery overnight. It is the perfect patient for an operation that strikes patiently. And it is vulnerable in exactly the places hardest to replace. A refinery is not one big tank. It is a web of distillation columns, heat exchangers, pumps, and above all, highly specialized catalytic crackers and hydrocrackers. These units are the heart of the whole thing. This is where heavy crude becomes the high-grade product a jet engine demands. They are expensive, they are complex, they have lead times of months to years, and a large part of this technology originally came from the West. This is where sanctions pressure bites like a vice. As long as Western spare parts, catalysts, and specialized technology sit under embargo, Russia cannot simply reorder a badly damaged cracker unit from the hardware store. The repair drags on. Improvisation is possible, but it is slow and it is worse. That means every successful hit removes capacity from the Russian economy not for days, but potentially for weeks or months. That is the difference between a fire and a standstill. And it tells us something about the severity of the hit. A plant that loses only a storage tank burns and keeps running. A plant that comes to a complete standstill has lost something central, a primary distillation unit, a control room, a piece of infrastructure without which nothing flows anymore. The complete standstill, then, is no lucky hit into a storage tank. It points to a blow into the nervous system of the plant. And let's forget the myth of reserve capacity. Some imagine Russia has mothballed refineries in reserve that simply spin up the moment another fails. That is not how it works. The Russian refining system was already running close to capacity before this campaign. When a plant the size of Syzran goes down, that loss cannot be quietly absorbed elsewhere. It leaves a hole, and the hole does not fill itself. The consequences are already visible inside the country. Russia has in the past imposed temporary export bans on gasoline to calm the domestic market. In individual regions, there were shortages and rising prices at the pump. These are the quiet symptoms of a wound opening deep inside no thunderclap, but a slow bleed. And the repair is no weekend project. Even when Russian technicians improvise, even when parts are sourced through back channels, it takes time. Bringing a damaged processing unit back online is a process of weeks, not hours. During that time, the plant runs not at all or only at throttled output. And while Syzran is being repaired, the drones hit the next one and the one after that. That is the purpose of a tempo of 11 per month. It gives the enemy no pause between blows. He who cannot close one wound before the next is torn open will bleed no matter how strong he is. Now the physics of the weapon. And here is the thing we most love to explain: math. A modern long-range drone of this kind costs a fraction of what it destroys. The figures vary, but the order of magnitude is clear: a machine cheaper than an average car against a plant worth hundreds of millions. That is not a fair trade. It is also not meant to be a fair trade. It is asymmetry as strategy, and this asymmetry sharpens over time. Drones can be built in factory halls by the thousands. Refineries cannot be erected by the thousands, certainly not under sanctions. One item scales upward, the other does not. The longer the campaign runs, the wider the gap opens. That is the nightmare of every defender and opponent, whose means grow cheaper, while your own losses grow more expensive. And the defense suffers under exactly the same math, only inverted. An air defense missile that intercepts one of these drones can cost a multiple of the drone. So Russia spends expensively to shoot down cheaply, and it has to win every single night. Ukraine only has to get through now and then. For a country the size of Russia with thousands of kilometers of infrastructure to protect seamless coverage is simply unaffordable. The blanket is too short. Cover the head and the feet freeze. And the drones play with that short blanket. They are slow, yes, but they are small. They fly low, and their route can be plotted around known positions. Russia's best air defense sits over Moscow and over a handful of key sites. Everything else is more thinly covered. Spread the systems wider, and each individual site gets weaker. Concentrate them, and hundreds of plants are left open. It is a choice with no right answer, the very definition of a strategic dilemma. This leads to the decisive link in the chain, the link that turns an economic story into a matter of life and death at the front. Let's follow the fuel. A refinery stands still. That means less refined kerosene, less jet fuel in the system. Less jet fuel means the Russian Air Force has to ration to set priorities to cancel sorties. Fewer sorties means fewer glide bombs dropped over Ukrainian cities and positions. And fewer bombs means at the end of this chain, Ukrainian soldiers and civilians who survive one more day. That is the logic behind the whole thing, and it is cold and clean. Ukraine cannot defeat the Russian Air Force in the air, but it can take away its breath on the ground in the refinery hundreds of kilometers away. It is air superiority won without a single dogfight. And then there is the economy of the war itself. Let's not forget Syzran's second job export via the Volga and the Caspian Sea. Russia finances this war in large part from the sale of oil and oil products. Every refinery standing still means not only less fuel in the tank, but also less product in the export stream, less hard currency in the war chest. Ukraine is therefore attacking two arteries at once, the military and the financial. One cut two bleeding vessels, and this second cut sits deeper than it seems. Russia can still sell its crude, the pipelines and tankers for raw oil keep running. But refined products like diesel and kerosene earn considerably more than raw crude. When the refineries fail, Russia has to export more crude at worse prices and even import expensive finished products itself. A country that refines and profits from it becomes a country that dumps raw material and buys back the refined kind. That is the quiet tax every hit imposes on the Russian war chest. That leaves the question why. Now this too is no coincidence. Spring and early summer drive fuel demand up, agriculture demands, diesel offensives are being prepared, the longer days make operations easier. The higher the demand, the more painful every outage. Ukraine strikes not only where Russia is weak, but also when it can least afford to do without. Let's step back and see the pattern as a whole. A single refinery is a wound. 11 in a month are a disease. The body of a war economy can compensate for one lost hit, perhaps even two. But it cannot in an endless loop replace lungs whose spare parts sit under embargo. That is exactly what the campaign targets, not the spectacular single blow, but exhaustion over time. It is engineering, not narrative. The numbers tell the story on their own if you only follow them long enough. Put it all together, and a picture emerges for which modern military history offers almost no precedent. This is not a series of isolated acts of sabotage. It is a de facto oil blockade, an embargo signed in no capital but enforced from the air. For the first time, a smaller power imposes a fuel blockade on a larger one, without a single fleet, without closing a single port. Where Britain once needed 100 ships today, machines that fit inside a warehouse suffice. That is why Syzran matters. Not because of the fire, because of the method. Ukraine has found a weakness that no amount of money can fix quickly: the fact that refineries are large, fixed, expensive to repair, and too numerous to protect all of them. And it has found a weapon cheap enough to exploit that weakness again and again. There is a second effect, too, a psychological one. Every hit carries the war into Russian regions that until now knew it only from the news. What seemed 800 kilometers away suddenly stands on one's own horizon as a column of smoke in the sky. What does this mean for the coming months? Here we leave the documented present and enter the field of probabilities. I will be honest about where I am sure and where I am betting. There are at the core three scenarios. First scenario: Russia patches the leak. Moscow shifts more air defense to the interior, protects the most important refineries more densely, or it compensates for the fuel shortage through imports deliveries from China, processing abroad, help from Iran. In that case, the campaign's effect fizzles. The refineries stand again the fuel flows, and Syzran remains a headline without consequences. Second scenario: Ukraine holds the tempo. 10, 11, 12 plants a month over 2-3 months. The pressure becomes cumulative. Russia can no longer talk away the fuel shortage and faces a brutal decision: it must pull air defense from the front to protect the interior. Every system that migrates inward is missing up front. And exactly where Russian air defense thins out, a window opens for Ukraine, a window for ground advances that were impossible before. And that window would not be small. Air defense in modern war is what decides the life and death of entire front sectors. Pull it out of the south or the east to cover refineries in Samara or Tatarstan, and Russia loses precisely there the umbrella under which its troops have been operating. Ukraine would only need to recognize that moment and use it. Third scenario: a grinding stalemate. Russia keeps losses just within the tolerable range. Ukraine cannot quite hold the tempo, and the war grinds on without either side getting the decisive lever. Which of these three weighs heaviest? To judge that, you don't have to look inside Moscow's mind, but at the cost and volume balance we just laid out. Here's where I place my bet. The second scenario is the most likely, at least in the medium term. And the reason lies not in Ukrainian optimism, but in the math we just took apart. The asymmetry of costs favors the attacker. The sheer size of the space to be protected favors the attacker. And the sanctions pressure that slows repairs favors the attacker. As long as these three factors hold, time is on the side of the drones. But, and this is the condition on which my forecast is allowed to fail and must honestly break if it occurs, there is a way out for Moscow. If Russia within roughly the next 8 weeks either opens a reliable alternative fuel source, say through massive imports from China or Iran, or actually closes the gap in the air defense of its interior, then the calculation tips. Then the blockade loses its bite, and my second scenario is refuted. Watch closely. If reports of hits taper off without Russia's fuel problems growing, then I was wrong, and I will say so. Note also, I am betting on a mechanism, not on a date. I am not saying on which day a window opens. I am saying under what conditions it opens. That is the difference between a forecast and a promise you cannot keep. So let's stay with what we know. We know that on the 25th of May, one of Russia's largest refineries came to a standstill. We know it was the 11th hit of the month. And we know that the weapon that did it cost less than a used car. The rest will be decided by geography and by the question of whether Moscow can find a shorter blanket than the one it has right now. Forget the big words and the dramatic music of other channels. This story needs no exaggeration. A machine cheaper than a car. A plant that processed 8.9 million tons and now stands still. 11 hits, 31 days. The numbers are the narrative. If my reading is right, you won't find the confirmation in a headline, but in a pattern. Watch for air defense systems that suddenly migrate east and into the interior. Watch for fuel prices that creep quietly upward in Russian regions. And watch for a sky over the Ukrainian front that grows a little emptier night after night. Those are the traces this story leaves long after the smoke over Syzran has cleared. If you want to know whether a cheap swarm of drones can really choke an empire, those are the signs that count. Share this video with someone who needs to see it and subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown. The smoke clears, the pattern stays.